In 1941, the bombing of Pearl Harbor drew the United States into a long and bitter conflict with the Empire of Japan as part of the Second World War. During 2 years of watching bitter European battles fought between the Allies and Germany, as Adolf Hitler stormed into neighbouring countries, the Americans had maintained their neutrality, despite President Roosevelt doing all he could to help the Allied cause. However, as the Japanese, Hitler's partners in the Axis powers, made a direct attack on the US naval fleet, the Americans were forced to take up arms and began to ship their troops far across the Pacific to face a distant and unpredictable enemy. The war with Japan would take 4 long years to conclude, but the cultural gulf between America and the land of the rising sun would make this a particularly vicious conflict. As the desperate empire resorted to increasingly extreme measures, the United States faced some of the most brutal battles in the history of warfare, and it soon became apparent that for Japan, surrender was never going to be an option. The only honourable outcome of the war was to triumph or to die in the pursuit of victory. By the summer of 1942, just 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had invaded every Allied colony in the Western Pacific. The Philippines, Malaya, Guam, Singapore and Hong Kong had all fallen swiftly to their imperial armies, while the war that had been raging between Japan and China continued. Led by their sense of duty and obedience to the emperor, the Japanese stormed through territories, islands and cities as swiftly as the Nazis had ravaged Europe. Though some nations welcomed the troops they believed would free them from European imperialism, it was soon clear that Japan's aims were to exploit the lands and people of the Pacific to save their own economy, so badly hit by sanctions imposed by the USA. Nevertheless, the dominance of Japan finally proved fallible in June 1942, when the tide of fortune suddenly began to turn against them in the Battle of Midway. The Japanese Admiral Yamamoto had sent a giant fleet to the Coral Island to complete the destruction of US naval forces that had been started at Pearl Harbor. But Allied intelligence had warned that the attack was imminent on this occasion, and the Americans were ready and waiting. The disastrous conflict now put Japan on the defensive, and the USA could at last feel confident that the war they'd entered so reluctantly, far from home, was one that it was now possible to win. Yet there was still a prolonged and difficult war ahead, and American industry stepped up production to an unprecedented level. Planes, ships, tanks, artillery and ammunition poured out of the factories to be dispatched directly into the Pacific theatre of operations. Japan had undoubtedly awoken a sleeping giant, and as the oil fueling its delicately balanced economy began to run out, it was soon clear the Empire of the Rising Sun faced a war that would ultimately lead their country to the brink of destruction and unimaginable devastation. The inhospitable battlegrounds where the war in the Pacific was played out were dense jungles, volcanic mountains, and a vast ocean filled with thousands of coral islands. It was worlds apart from the conflict being fought on the European continent. The terrain was difficult to negotiate, and the sweltering heat, humidity, and persistent tropical rain made conditions extraordinarily uncomfortable for the struggling troops. But the Americans brought with them a number of remarkable commanders who would inspire their subordinates to greatness, even in the most challenging of conditions that the war in the Pacific frequently posed. Perhaps the most famous of all was General Douglas MacArthur, who'd been based in the Philippines with his family for many years when the Japanese invaded in 1941. After being ordered to leave by President Roosevelt, MacArthur began gathering together Allied forces in Australia, ready to reclaim territory in the Southwest Pacific. The other leading American commander was Admiral Chester Nimitz, who would command naval operations from Pearl Harbor, thousands of miles away in Hawaii. While the war in Europe had become a combined initiative, Roosevelt and Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill agreed that the United States should have more power over the military affairs in the Pacific, relying heavily on the strength of the US Navy. Britain would, however, continue to influence the battles in Burma, which stood dangerously close to India, still very much a part of the British Empire. The Allies' aim was to secure land from which they could attack the heart of Japan, forcing an unconditional surrender. But before they could even contemplate closing in on Tokyo, they had other pressing problems to resolve. Just the presence of Japanese troops in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea posed a dangerous risk to Australia and New Zealand, which in turn threatened to cut off support from America to the Allied territory. The Japanese began to build airfields on the largest of the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, and the Allies planned their first offensive against Japan in August 1942. As the battle to seize an airfield in the remote tropical jungles of Guadalcanal raged, it developed into one of the bloodiest engagements in the history of American warfare. It was such a remote island, few people had heard of it, but its name would soon be indelibly carved into the memories of the men who fought there. US soldiers courageously battled through forests infested with malaria in soaring temperatures, and during the 6 months that the fighting for Guadalcanal went on, many of the lives lost were as a result of disease. The relentless struggle saw the emergence of another remarkable character in the shape of the fiercely aggressive Admiral William Halsey, known to his men as Bull Halsey. The colourful commander had been at sea when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and was renowned for his determination to exact revenge on behalf of the USA. While American troops continued to push towards Guadalcanal's airfield, Halsey commanded naval battles which roared on the seas around the island. Ships and planes alike were destroyed, and Japan's losses steadily grew, while in Tokyo, the emperor prayed for peace. With defeat looming, he finally granted the imperial troops permission to withdraw, and by 1943, the Allies were able to claim victory. But as Halsey drove ever onward up the chain of Solomon Islands towards Bougainville, far from the sweltering jungles of the South Pacific, an often overlooked battle was being fought in the freezing snows of a group of Alaskan islands to the north. Japanese forces had invaded the Aleutian Islands in the summer of 1942, and thousands of Canadian and American troops had now been charged with the task of ousting them from the remote region. Scaling icy mountains and battling through frozen fog made their duties equally as daunting as those experienced by American service personnel fighting in the tropics to the south. After months of ferocious fighting, the Allies eventually drove the intruders from the islands, but victory had come at a very high price. By the end of the campaign, thousands of lives had been lost, and both the Allies and the Japanese had to count the cost. While battling continued over Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, a new offensive was being fought on New Guinea by Australian and American troops. From his base in Australia, General MacArthur commanded the proceedings, seizing bases from Lee to Rabaul, while Admiral Nimitz coordinated battles on the Gilbert Islands in the Central Pacific. Island by island, the advance headed steadily towards Japan, while to the west of the empire, the British worked with US and Chinese troops to force the Japanese out of Burma. The country had been invaded in 1942, cutting off the main supply line to China via the Burma Road. Aid could now only reach the country by flying over what the Allies called the Hump, namely the Himalayas. American General Joseph Stilwell had arrived in Burma just as it fell to the Japanese. As commander of the China-Burma Theatre, he was responsible for all American Lend-Lease supplies to the Chinese, and his main goal was to open a land route to China from India and to seize Burma from the Japanese. With his chief of staff, Frank Murrill, Stilwell began to plan a route that could cut through Thailand and India to connect with the end of the Burma Road in China to the east. Thousands of dollars were poured into the project to create the Lido Road, which would twist through bottomless passes and thick jungles from the railhead in Assam in India to deliver supplies to the Chinese and Allied forces fighting in northern Burma. As the Chinese and Americans collaborated on this remarkable construction, at the Quebec Conference in 1943, the Allied leaders, Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt, introduced a new commander to represent British interests in the Pacific, Lord Louis Mountbatten.
Has been appointed to the Southeast Asia Command.
They also decided that while the road was being built, the best method of advance in Burma would be by using special forces to penetrate deep into enemy territory. The British Indian Army Special Force, known as the Chindits, had been very successful, operating deep behind Japanese lines, and soon similar forces were organised by the Americans under Stilwell's operations officer, Frank Murrill. While engineers and mechanics took on the impossible task of rolling their road through the dense forests and swamps ahead of them, Murrill led his specially trained unit to pinpoint enemy strongholds and keep the Japanese at bay. Air support flew over the difficult terrain, dropping supplies to the 3,000-strong team, who soon became known as Murrill's Marauders. Further east, the Japanese had constructed their own route through the Burmese jungle in the form of the Burma Railway, which spanned the infamous River Kwai. As US submarines became a threat to supplies arriving by sea, they'd started to construct a route between Bangkok in Thailand and Rangoon, the capital of Burma. progress was speedier than on the American Lido Road, as the Japanese mobilized thousands of prisoners of war to work at breakneck speed. The Japanese were becoming notorious for their horrific treatment of prisoners, who were frequently tortured and routinely starved. Working on the Burma Railway was virtually a death sentence, and in the disease-infested jungles, those who didn't die of starvation fell victim to malaria, typhoid and cholera. By the time the railway was completed in the autumn of 1943, over 100,000 Allied prisoners of war had died during its construction. As Stilwell's Lido Road plunged deeper into the wild terrain of Burma, Murrell's marauders were making headway despite sustaining heavy losses. On May the 17th, 1944, the special unit seized the Myit Kina airstrip in Burma, despite strong resistance from the enemy. Stilwell arrived to congratulate his chief officer Murrell, but the battle was far from over. The next 2 months were spent grappling with the Japanese stronghold of Myit Kina town. When the campaign eventually ended, the victory would once again be claimed by the Allies, and within months the Lido Road reached China, while Stilwell's now battle-hardened men pushed further south. To the east, MacArthur and Nimitz had now reached Japan's main line of defence, having captured the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, and the Mariana Islands were the next Allied target. The archipelago, made up of volcanic mountains, emerged from the deepest, darkest depths of the world's oceans, extending from Guam at its southern tip to the islands of Saipan, Tinian and Rosa to the north. This was just over 1,000 miles from Tokyo and was the most vital point in Japan's defence. From here, the Americans could reach the capital and repeat the bombings that had been so psychologically damaging to the nation in the Dolittle raids of 1942. Before the ambitious attack on the Marianas took place, the US Navy had another important mission to launch on the other side of the globe. It was June 1944, and the invasion of France was about to take place. On June the 6th, thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy to face Hitler's army of occupation head-on, before beating the Nazis back towards the borders of their homeland. As more Allied servicemen flooded into France, the American General Holland Smith in the Pacific ordered the bombardment of Saipan, one of the most strategic of the Marianas. The shell attacks were soon followed by teams of Navy divers who began taking out mines and scouting for landing beaches suitable for a very different invasion to the one taking place in Normandy. With preparations in place as US forces approached the shores of Saipan, in Tokyo, orders went out to the Japanese ships in the region, and every man was told that the fate of the Empire rests on this one battle, and it would indeed prove to be one of the most significant events in the War for the Pacific. Early in the morning of June the 15th, Marine divisions under General Smith began landing on the island in waves, while the sea exploded around them with Japanese shell attacks. Within hours, there were thousands of men on the beaches, soon to be joined by army forces. As the troops advanced, under heavy gunfire from the Japanese, they quickly managed to secure the beach and began to march northwards over the treacherous island terrain. Meanwhile, American radar picked up the huge swarm of planes closing in as Japanese Zero bombers were launched from the carriers, and as a result, the attack would not be the victory Tokyo had prayed for. As American battleships and destroyers opened fire, hundreds of aircraft plunged into the sea, and with so many of the enemy shot down, the Americans called the battle the Mariana Turkey Shoot. US submarines caused even greater damage as they torpedoed Japanese carriers, while over the mountainous terrain of central Saipan, the Japanese troops were driven further north. Hell's Pocket and Death Valley were just some of the names the Americans gave to the features of battle, vividly describing the brutal fight that continued. But by the beginning of July, the Japanese had nowhere to retreat, and in a final bid for victory, 3,000 of them flooded down the mountains to attack the US forces. What then followed would horrify the American soldiers even more, as the brainwashed civilians of Saipan began to commit mass suicide as they'd been convinced that the Americans were barbarians. Along with many Imperial Japanese soldiers, thousands jumped from the cliffs into the sea below, while the US troops could only look on in disbelief. Amidst the horror, one American-Mexican soldier who spoke Japanese managed to persuade soldiers hiding in caves that they would not be mistreated, and in fact over 800 lives, including civilians, were saved when they turned themselves over to the man who became known as the Pied Piper of Saipan. Although many prisoners were taken alive thanks to his efforts, it was rare for Japanese soldiers to surrender. In their culture, it was considered dishonourable and a fate worse than death. As the Allies claimed an overwhelming victory on Saipan, the mortified naval commanders of the Japanese Empire attempted to conceal the true outcome of the conflict. As they had done after the Battle of Midway 2 years earlier, they claimed the battle was a great triumph, but the truth was soon discovered, and in its wake, the Japanese Prime Minister Tojo was forced to resign, while another military leader, General Koisu Kuniaki, took his place. While the Japanese rearranged their cabinet, the Americans were fighting their way onto the remaining Mariana Islands, Tinian and Guam. By the time the campaign had come to an end, over 40,000 Japanese troops were dead, and their disgraced commanders committed ritual suicide. With the invasion of the Marianas complete, in August 1944, the Allies began to construct valuable airfields for the next stage of the war. But a difference of opinion was splitting the Army and the Navy. MacArthur was keen to liberate the Philippines as the next priority, while Nimitz, following the advice of his Fleet Admiral Ernest King, felt they should head for Formosa, which was closer to Japan. With the discussion between the two Pacific commanders far from resolved, Roosevelt finally summoned MacArthur to Honolulu to settle on a course of action with himself and Nimitz. MacArthur presented his argument to the president, saying that America had an obligation to the Filipinos, who would support an invasion unlike the people of Formosa. The general had been ordered to leave the Philippines in 1942 for the safety of Australia, but had never forgotten his men left there to fight, who'd been taken prisoner by the Japanese. MacArthur was now quick to remind Roosevelt of their duty to the thousands of American captives, as well as the millions of loyal Filipino citizens who were now under Japan's rule. Close to running for his fourth term as president, Roosevelt was wary of public opinion and quickly granted MacArthur's request to return to the Pacific archipelago. Nimitz agreed and assisted, providing his naval forces led by Admiral Halsey. Early in October 1944, Halsey's carriers began attacking Japanese air bases on the islands of Okinawa and Formosa. This would considerably weaken air defences before the invasion of the Philippines. The strike so close to the homeland shocked Japan, and with their air and naval power badly battered, Imperial commanders began to devise extreme measures for the battle to come. Unaware of the new tactics being prepared by the Japanese, on October 20th, 1944, General MacArthur strode through the sea to come ashore on the Philippine island of Leyte. Planes roared overhead and troops began battling on the beaches, while the new Philippine president, Sergio Osmeña, marched alongside the commander. It was a historic moment, and as MacArthur rallied the people of the Philippines to strike out against the enemy, it gave hope to many fighting throughout the Pacific. The coast of Leyte was the springboard from which MacArthur hoped to take Luzon in the central Philippines before beginning the final assault against Japan. Within days, a major sea battle was raging, but the Japanese had plotted to lure Halsey's battleships away from MacArthur's invading force. A decoy fleet, made up of empty carriers, drew Halsey northwards, leaving MacArthur's flanks dangerously exposed. Back at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz realised that Halsey had fallen into a trap and immediately signalled his admiral. It was a near disaster, and one that MacArthur squarely blamed on Washington for splitting commands between Nimitz and himself. It was fortunate that Japan's defences were weakened, and Allied forces had quickly seized the beaches of Leyte without Halsey's battleships. The failure of the decoy to ruin the attack now led the Japanese to resort to some of the most shocking tactics ever seen in warfare. It was decided that special kamikaze attacks should be instigated to disable American carriers. On behalf of their countrymen, young Japanese pilots began to plunge to their deaths. Such destruction made it clear that Japan's situation was more desperate than ever. Whether in Tokyo or out in the countryside, the people could no longer adequately feed or clothe themselves. There was a shortage of farm workers as more and more men and women joined the Japanese war machine, while the Allied blockade continued to hamper vital food supplies arriving from Korea and China. Despite the hardships for Japanese civilians, surrender was as ever the last thing on the minds of the Japanese military. As MacArthur's troops plunged deeper into Philippine territory and towards Luzon, the Japanese forces fought back furiously, and the Americans still had a huge fight on their hands. As the new year approached, back in the USA, Roosevelt, now in his fourth term as president, wished American troops across the globe a Merry Christmas, remembering those fighting in the bitter cold on the front lines of Europe, as well as those battling with the heat in the jungles and swamps of Burma and the Pacific Islands. Far from home, the president's words might have offered comfort, But for the Americans, as the war in Europe seemed to be drawing to a close, the same could not be said of the war in the Pacific with the Japanese. By February 1945, the troops marching through the Philippines had finally reached the gates of Manila. The capital of the Philippines had once been known as the Pearl of the Orient, but as the Allies fought back, the Japanese troops inflicted unimaginable devastation on the city. As the fight turned in the Allies' favour, the Japanese retaliated by murdering thousands of civilians and destroying every building in their path. By the time the city was declared secure, 100,000 Filipinos were dead, and the capital was little more than a pile of rubble. It must have been devastating for MacArthur to see the city he knew so well in ruins. But as the smoke cleared, there was some consolation for the commander. Prisoners of war began to pour from the camps, thin and gaunt, after nearly 4 years in captivity, and amongst them MacArthur found many of his former soldiers. He told them, "I'm a little late, but we finally came." And it was, no doubt, an extremely moving moment for all concerned. As the Americans battled on to secure the rest of the country, on the other side of the globe, major decisions were being made between the three great powers, America, Britain, and the Soviet Union, at the Yalta Conference in the Crimea. By now it was clear that despite Lend-Lease support from America, the Chinese were becoming even more concerned with battling the communists under Mao Zedong instead of defeating Japan. Consequently, the Americans and the British found themselves looking in an unlikely direction for reinforcements. Roosevelt and Churchill now turned to Stalin, who'd claimed overwhelming victories in the Russian battles against Hitler's armies. The American president tempted Stalin into the Pacific War, promising that the territory the Soviet Union had lost to Japan in 1905 would be returned to the Russians. With the struggle against Nazi Germany reaching an inevitable conclusion, Stalin made the secret pact that he would join the fight against Japan 3 months after he had concluded the war with Hitler. Now, as the war continued and airfields were built throughout the Pacific Islands, the Allies were soon ready to launch their next step in the quest for victory. Daylight raids had already begun on Japanese industrial targets, but as they proved unsuccessful, Washington had called for more extreme tactics, and General Curtis E. LeMay would introduce a horrifying new chapter in the war against Japan as he proposed a new strategy. However, before LeMay's plan could be launched, there was a major problem that needed to be resolved. The tiny island of Iwo Jima to the south of the Japanese mainland was a major headache for the American bombers. Japanese Zero planes were based there and were a deadly threat to the American air bases on Saipan, so Admiral Nimitz mobilized troops to attack the craggy isle. For the soldiers, by now battle-weary and shattered by the Pacific struggle, it was essential that they found the strength to continue. Many had been at war for a long time and were suffering from combat fatigue and were desperate to return home. But what they now faced on Iwo Jima would be one of the most terrible battles of the Pacific War. General Holland Smith, who led the attack, had seen intelligence reports and was well aware of the strategic difficulties. US Air Force planes had already started to bombard Iwo Jima to break down Japanese defences, but their soldiers were hidden in caves around the tiny island, and the bombing attacks barely even grazed their defences. The general requested 10 days of naval bombardment before his Marines charged the beaches, but his request was rejected. Instead, they would have to make do with 3. On February the 19th, thousands of Marines began to land on the beaches while the Japanese waited until waves of troops had assembled before attacking. Suddenly, the air was filled with the thunder of the heaviest gunfire many had ever seen. Unable to dig foxholes in the volcanic sand, the Marines had no option but to move towards the barrage of bullets, and by sundown there were more than 2,000 Allied casualties. Slowly, the American forces moved towards the base of Mount Surubachi and fought in what one reporter described as a nightmare from hell. The island would have to be wrenched from the Japanese, trench by trench, in a terrible and bloody battle, and when the tanks rolled in on the second day of the invasion, the advance moved closer to the target, and by February the 23rd, the summit was within reach. That morning, a patrol of 40 men were ordered to the top of Mount Surubachi, where, if they succeeded, they would plant the American flag. As the iconic image that gave hope to the people of the USA attests, the daring mission was accomplished and has gone down in history as one of the defining moments of World War II. Even so, the battle for Iwo Jima didn't end that day. It would be another month before victory was assured, and although triumphant, American casualties had far exceeded those of the Japanese. With Iwo Jima secure, the Allies were now close to the homeland of Japan, and Liu Mei had the opportunity to test his newly devised strategy, firebombing the Empire's cities. On the night of March the 9th, over 300 B-29s attacked Tokyo for nearly 3 hours. Fires burnt out of control, creating a firestorm that boiled the waters of the canals and cisterns. It was the most destructive non-nuclear attack in human history. 100,000 people perished and 1 million were made homeless, but this was only the beginning. The Great Tokyo Raid marked the start of a 5-month period during which Japan would suffer unbelievable devastation. Moving from one city to another, B-29s rose menacingly from the runways the Americans had built at Guam, Tinian and Saipan, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. In Tokyo, beautiful architecture lay in ruins, and even part of the Imperial Palace was hit. Millions fled for the hills, and for the first time, Japanese civilians began to turn against the military. It even became dangerous to wear a military uniform in some parts of the country. But through the terror shone one ray of hope, as the bombings convinced the Japanese government that they needed to work towards peace. While the firebomb strategy of Liu Mei continued as March gave way to April, Nimitz set his sights on the next stepping stone towards a total victory over Japan. Okinawa was a heavily fortified island, once the kingdom of the Ryukyu, before the Japanese had abolished its monarchy and annexed its land. It stood just 500 miles from Japan. In an operation called Iceberg, an attack began on April 1st, 1945. Ships, including those of the British Pacific Fleet, delivered Marine and Army divisions to the island's shores, and for the first time, Chester Nimitz's Marines and Douglas MacArthur's soldiers fought side by side under the command of Lieutenant General Buckner. As the troops came ashore in their landing crafts, they were met with little opposition, but before long they discovered they were far from home and dry. As on Iwo Jima, Japanese soldiers were hidden in the caves and hilly terrain around the ancient stronghold of Shuri Castle. But while American soldiers struggled to root out the enemy from their hideouts, back aboard the ships, another surprise was in store for the Allied troops, as the Japanese set in motion their last great attack, Operation Chrysanthemum. The Japanese now turned to the ancient myth of the kamikaze, as thousands of young pilots were torn between duty to their families and the will to survive, balanced against their duty to serve Japan and die for the cause. They now had to prepare themselves for missions from which they knew they would never return. On April the 6th, the Japanese commander Ugaki unleashed the first of the kamikaze bombers. The American fleet couldn't believe their eyes as they witnessed the surreal spectacle of wave after wave of aircraft plunging towards them and certain death. Smoke and flames enveloped the scene as planes and ships were caught up in the explosions. No country had ever invaded the land of the rising sun, and the legend of the kamikaze had arisen from a fierce windstorm that prevented a Mongol armada invading Japan centuries earlier, and translating as divine wind, the kamikaze legacy was passed on to the indoctrinated pilots who were now, quite literally, Japan's last hope. In a final bid for victory, the Japanese even sent their largest battleship, the Yamato, as a giant kamikaze attack to destroy the American fleet, but it sank before reaching the ships. Then, while the battle continued to rage, there was another change in the Japanese leadership. Prime Minister Kunio-ki was replaced by Baron Suzuki, an aged hero from the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. He was a popular figure, and it was a good indication that those who were prepared to discuss a peaceful settlement were at last being listened to by the government. Also, within days of this Japanese appointment, there was a change in America's leadership when President Roosevelt suddenly died. It was a great blow to the Allies, and from the streets of Washington to the beaches of Okinawa, civilians and soldiers alike mourned the loss of a president who'd promised the American dream and delivered a safer future for the world through freedom and democracy. Roosevelt's vice president, Harry S. Truman, now took charge of America, while as the Red Army rolled their tanks into Berlin, the war in Europe was drawing to a close. On May the 8th, 1945, victory was celebrated throughout Europe, but as flags were waved and cheers filled the air, there was little consolation for the men still fighting on Okinawa. For them, the war was far from over. On VE Day, 2 kamikaze pilots slipped past the radar screens and killed hundreds as they exploded onto the decks of an Allied vessel. It would take another 6 weeks before the bitterly fought battle for Okinawa finally ended on June the 21st, 1945. The casualties on both sides were horrific, and for the Americans, even General Buckner, the man who'd led them into battle, was killed. Japanese civilians and soldiers alike began to commit mass suicide, and the Allied soldiers who survived would be forever haunted by the nightmarish scenes of Okinawa. By now, US casualties in the Pacific for the first half of 1945 had exceeded those suffered during the previous 3 years put together. As the victory flags were raised in the Philippines and in Okinawa, these dreadful last battles now forced the Allied leaders to rethink their plans for invading Japan's homeland, which would inevitably lead to even greater casualties. On June the 12th, the Japanese had passed laws calling for all males from 15 to 60 and all women from 17 to 40 to do military service. By the summer of 1945, every man and woman in Japan was a member of the People's Volunteer Army, with the government having declared martial law, making Japan a war zone. It seemed that any hopes for peace were far from being realised. All across Japan, the inhabitants drilled with spears made from bamboo and other makeshift weapons in preparation for the final battles. If the invasion came, they would be prepared. However, the ability of the Japanese people to fight was increasingly undermined by the blockade, starvation, Allied bomb attacks, and the collapse of industrial production. On the day the Philippines celebrated their liberation, on July the 5th, 1,000 bomber raids against Japan began, as planes took off from Okinawa. The civilians sheltering inside their bamboo huts had little chance against the onslaught of the American attack. All across Japan, civilians called for peace, desperate to end the war, as the American bombers continued to destroy everything in their path. But the military, still driven by ancient traditions, felt that it was better to die than surrender, and battled on. They were still fighting in Burma and deep in the jungles of the Philippines, Manchuria, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And while all this was going on, American commanders tried everything they could think of to negotiate a Japanese surrender, but were met with silence from Tokyo. The terrors of the kamikaze attacks, coupled with the fierce determination of the Japanese to fight to the death, no matter what, left the new President of America in no doubt whatsoever that concluding the war in the Pacific would cost the lives of many more US servicemen, and Truman had a very difficult decision to make. Far away in New Mexico, an explosion shattered the silence. It was July the 16th, 1945, and based on Einstein's formula, Allied scientists had finally realised their goal: to create the deadliest and most powerful weapon on Earth, the atom bomb. That very same day, Stalin, Truman and Churchill met to discuss the future of Germany and Japan at the Potsdam Conference. The American president was well aware of the power that was now within his grasp, but unlike Roosevelt had been, Truman was very wary about Stalin joining the war in the Pacific. The Soviets had dominated the end of the war in Europe in the Battle of Berlin, and in the aftermath, the communist threat of a Cold War had already put the British and the Americans on their guard. On July the 26th, 1945, at Potsdam, the three great powers made a final plea for Japan to surrender. Their terms were that those responsible for the policies that had led to war were to be forever eliminated, the war criminals should be punished, and Japan occupied. Truman gave the Japanese a stern warning, although at this time they had no idea just how devastating the consequences of not heeding it were likely to be. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on Earth. The Japanese Prime Minister's reply was seemingly inscrutable, perhaps due in some part to the ambiguities of the Japanese language, but the Allies took it as a final gesture of defiance. As Stalin gathered Soviet forces on the borders of Japanese-occupied Manchuria in northeastern China, the USA hurried their preparations in the race for Japan. On August the 6th, 1945, Truman ordered the atom bomb to be loaded onto a B-29 plane named after the pilot's mother, Enola Gay. It took off from the runway on the island of Tinian, its target the city of Hiroshima, an important military centre with a civilian population of 300,000. It was a calm, sunny Monday morning, and after an earlier air raid alert had been called off, by 8:15 the city was bustling with activity as soldiers did their morning calisthenics, commuters hurried to and fro, and groups of women and children worked outside. When the bomb was dropped, those closest to the explosion died instantly, as the nuclear blast caused buildings and humans alike to disintegrate. Paper 6,000 feet from the centre of the blast ignited immediately as temperatures became as hot as the surface of the sun. Birds burst into flames, and those who weren't killed by the initial explosion were engulfed by the firestorm that ensued. The blast of white light burnt patterns into human skin and shadows onto walls. Those dark shapes were all that would remain of many of Hiroshima's inhabitants. 4 hours after the attack, the Japanese government didn't know what had happened. But when a plane was dispatched to survey the city from 100 miles away, the staff officer aboard could see the huge cloud of smoke. The devastation was beyond belief. Yet the true horror of the situation was only just beginning to become evident. It would take several days before the Japanese realized that survivors were dying from radiation sickness as the death rate began to climb. Once more, Tokyo attempted to hide the shocking news, while President Truman made the announcement that the atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima and warned that if Japan still refused to surrender, there would be another nuclear attack. When Tokyo failed to respond to the call for an unconditional surrender, a second bomb was dropped on August the 9th, this time on Nagasaki. As Japan quaked once more, in a dugout beneath the Imperial Palace, the fate of the Japanese people was being decided. The Emperor of Japan, Hirohito, faced with further nuclear attacks, was forced to put aside the ancient traditions of his people, announcing that the endurable must be endured. For the Empire of the Rising Sun to have any future, there was no other option than surrender. So, reluctantly, on August the 14th, Japan accepted the Potsdam Declaration, and although Hirohito was still unable to acknowledge that Japan had lost the war, he did declare that the war had not ended favourably for Japan. Despite there being disastrous final attempts by the Japanese military to seize control and fight on, in a matter of weeks, the struggle was over. On September the 2nd, 1945, a Japanese delegation boarded the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay to formally surrender to the Allies. The moment was broadcast across the globe, and when all the nations that had taken part in the Pacific battles had signed the document, MacArthur drew the war to a poignant close, saying, "Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world." Six days later, he drove his troops into Japan to occupy the nation that he had battled against for nearly 4 years. The Japanese would now learn to live alongside the Americans, and their nation would evolve to survive in this new world where foreigners infiltrated every walk of Japanese life. The British, French, and American flags were raised across the Pacific once more, and mankind could finally celebrate the end of the Second World War. 50 million people had died in the long and terrible conflict. And although the Allies had finally triumphed over the Axis, the advent of the atom bomb meant that never again could there be a world war without there being a real danger of totally destroying life on Earth.